Journalists in fear, the end of press freedom? That's the question we want to address today on Quadriga. Hello and welcome. World Press Freedom Day is just around the corner. Would you, dear audience, risk your lives to tell the truth? Journalists and bloggers around the world are doing it on a daily basis. They're information hunters, but they themselves are often the hunted. In war zones, in authoritarian societies, increasingly even in democracies. Whether Mexico or China, Turkey or Poland, pressure is rising on those who report the facts. Mistrust, censorship, and persecution rather than freedom and respect. An alarming downward spiral. And that's what we want to talk about today with three guests who have been directly affected by declining press freedom. Meera Jamal is a freelance journalist from Pakistan. She had to leave the country because her life was endangered due to her work. She believes that journalism without press freedom becomes a work of fiction and loses contact with reality on the ground. Mona Kareem belongs to a bedoon family from Kuwait. They are stateless. Like many badoons, they fell through the cracks when Kuwait became independent in 1961. As a blogger, she says, journalism under authoritarianism becomes the best tool of resistance. And it's a pleasure to welcome Andreas Kluth. He's a German-American journalist and Berlin-based correspondent for The Economist. He says a French philosopher once said every country gets the government it deserves. Today, we know every country also gets the press it deserves. Freedom of the press is today the first signal of freedom generally. So let me start out with you, Ms. Jamal, and ask you to tell us just a bit about your personal story. You found yourself unable to work in your own country, in Pakistan. How and why?
The situation in Pakistan is quite different to what we see here. The social pressure, the religious pressure, the political pressure. See, as a journalist, if you look at things with different perspective than the mass perspective, then you find yourself in danger anyhow. So as a woman, I was in danger. As a person without beliefs, I was in danger. And as a journalist, if I tried to bring those things into limelight, whatever was going wrong, I was in danger.
As I understand it, you had been doing some reporting on women, on children's situation, even on prostitutes. None of that is directly what got you into trouble. What got you into trouble was writing about a Quran school. What happened then?
No, actually, I was getting emails and hate mails, as you call them right now, on my women's rights issue articles as well. But Quran Shule, it was like hitting the head on the nail on the head. The thing was that it is such a sensitive topic for most of the Pakistanis that you can't question religion. And if they are sending their children to a Quran Shule or a Quran school, then they have the right to do so. And you can't question the method that they use to teach there, whether it's using the stick or hitting them, abusing them in any way. They just accept it. That's how it is. And I tried to write about it and got myself into trouble.
Exactly what kind of trouble? Briefly, what happened to you then?
Threats. I was encountered by people with knives who threatened me personally. I was getting phone calls, emails, everything that if I don't quit, I'd get myself into trouble.
Mona Kareem, a bit then on your story as well. What were you reporting on in Kuwait? What kind of experiences did you have?
I was working in a newspaper, and really my work in the newspaper wasn't that controversial for authorities because already media is very well controlled, you know, so not only by the state, but even the owners of the media, you know, do not want to pass any criticism. But in my blogging, you know, especially after Twitter and Facebook and the Arab Spring, all that context brought so much visibility, you know, to whatever criticism you bring. So when that happened in 2011, I was using my blog and Twitter to report on the protest by the stateless community that I belong to. That upset the authorities. They don't want these news to come out. You know, they don't want, you know, the news on arrest, for example, to come out. So the reaction was, you know, some harassment and hate mail. I was not arrested, but I certainly was questioned, you know, for speaking up.
And the harassment was coming from whom? From official government sources?
Yes, mostly from officials. Of course, they don't do it in a direct and a documented way, you know, because that might trouble them somehow. But as you mentioned, you know, interrogations, questions, phone calls, you know, threats. And on the other side, of course, you get all these anonymous people on the internet sending you messages to scare you off. And you never know, even if these people were sent by the government or voluntarily doing it.
You mentioned that you came from a group of people who were considered stateless, meaning you had no citizenship, you had no passport. How'd you get yourself out of the country? You now live in New York.
Yes. So my community, to say it briefly, you know, don't have any sort of documentation going all the way to a birth certificate or a marriage certificate, access to education and health, all of that. But some of us would rarely get, you know, a travel document that can be used one time and to leave the country. And that's what happened in my case, especially that I was a journalist. So after you leave, you're never allowed back. You know, it was a way to, let's say, indirect exiling. You know, they wait for you to leave and never allow you again.
Perhaps it's worth noting for our audience, our two guests were comparing their situations beforehand. Neither of them can go back to their home countries. Both of them have refugee travel documents rather than passports, so to speak. Andreas Kluth, you talked about the fact that a country's press is essentially also a signal of how much freedom it allows. Would you say, as a reporter for The Economist, you come from countries, you're both German and American, in which press freedom is intact?
I certainly feel lucky, as I think you do as well, after listening to these two stories. You're right, I'm German, I'm American, my employer is British. I have three Western countries that value freedom of the press in different ways, in subtly different ways, but they value them, and I've never felt any pressure overtly there, although I've had recently my first Twitter, if I may so, shitstorm. That's now a term d'art. I had a bit of that, a phenomenon, and I think that's an interesting one to get into. I once covered from Hong Kong, mainland China, for The Economist. We used to, I'd never felt a major threat, but it was an open secret that we were assigned translators and drivers, and whenever we went into the mainland, they followed us around, our phones were tapped, we knew that. It was almost a subject to amuse ourselves about. So I've been privileged, I feel, especially compared to these two.
You also mentioned something else which I think is quite relevant, briefly touched on by Ms. Kareem as well, namely self-censorship when you were based in Hong Kong. Can you just say a word about that?
We can get into it and more, but it's important to keep in mind that, of course, government censorship, authoritarian regimes, is the traditional threat that we're all looking out for. But there are other forms, and one is self-censorship. It was just an example from when I was in Hong Kong at the time. The big discussion, the controversy there was not over whether the Hong Kong government, it was part of China, but one country, two systems. The Hong Kong government was not trying to censor any press. But some of the press organs were owned by tycoons, so-called, who wanted to ingratiate themselves with Beijing. And maybe you can have private sector self-censorship. It's been an issue in Britain with the Murdoch press, etc. There are these other elements. Censorship and threats to press freedom can sometimes come from sources other than the government.
Let's take a closer look at exactly that aspect, namely the different forms that repression can take. And I'd like to just take a look at the World Press Freedom map that we have. We have World Press Freedom Day around the corner, and Reporters Without Borders puts out a map where we can see the degree to which press freedoms are under threat. And essentially what we see there, more countries where press freedom is under threat than where press freedom is open. So many places in the world, press freedom is on retreat. Reporters Without Borders says Europe has the freest media. We see it here in the map. Africa, interestingly enough, coming in second place, surpassing the Americas for the first time. Eastern Europe, Central Asia, North Africa, Middle East, they all find themselves toward the bottom of the ratings. So I'd like to stay for a while in the Middle East and Islamic world and look at some of the forms that suppression can take there. And let me ask you, Ms. Jamal, you talked about feeling threatened. As I understand it, a lot of these threats came from individuals. But would you say in the end that the government was letting that happen also as a way to suppress you?
The biggest threat of being in Pakistan is that I was an atheist, and you can't say that. If I say that in public, I'll be murdered. There are lots of incidents of Christians being hacked to death and burned to death, and the violence in the society is growing so much that it's out of control. And the state, the Islamic law that we have, all shelters that. So it's not like, you know, if someone kills a person who has converted out of Islam, they are justified to do that because the state punishment for that is also death.
So the rise of sectarianism feeding the kind of results that we saw there on the map when we look at the Middle East and North Africa. Would you agree, Ms. Kareem?
Yeah, certainly. I think also authoritarian regimes, say in the Gulf, for example, have used the sectarian card as a way, you know, to further persecute activists and journalists, you know. As you said, the one way to persecute them is to allow people to troll them and to threaten them and, you know, have no accountability to safeguard these voices, you know. So it's not only one method of suppression by jailing them and interrogating them, but even allowing others to do it. And there are governments, such as the Bahraini government, that hired, you know, PR companies based in Europe and the US to specifically do that, troll people and, you know, defame them and deprive them of their legitimacy when talking.
Can I just ask, was religion an issue in your case?
No, the religion wasn't an issue in my case. Most of my work has been about the stateless, but also immigrants in the Gulf and what kind of legal obstacles are, you know, they face and persecution, I would say.
But essentially, you were the voice of a minority, at any rate, an ethnic minority. Andreas Kluth, are we seeing the rise not only in these regions of the world, North Africa, Middle East, but even here in Eastern Europe, of something you might call majoritarianism, the idea that it's only the majority's voice that can and should be heard?
I'm not sure that we're seeing the rise of it, but I am sure that that's always been one of the classic threats to freedom. In fact, James Madison, one of the founding fathers of America, he coined that word, majoritarianism. And he was thinking back to ancient Athens, which was a pure democracy, when he was writing to the Americans at the time who were trying to figure out how to create a free republic. Said, be careful, it doesn't just mean democracy all the time. If we vote on everything, then we get what's happening in some of these places that you mentioned, then the majority will oppress the minority. To a large extent, freedom is actually the protection of minorities against majorities. It's a mixture, and that's why they created the republic. And I think that is an eternal dance between majoritarianism, where the minority live in fear, and that's not freedom, and a sort of more balanced regime between democracy with checks and balances and a separate judiciary and a separate free press, so that everyone can be free, including free from each other and from majorities.
Would you subscribe to that same view, Ms. Jamal? And if so, how can someone in Pakistan who wants to bring a minority perspective into the open, how can they do it?
Recently, it's going to be made impossible because they're trying to pass a cybercrime bill in Pakistan, which has been approved by the lower house of the parliament. And that law ensures that anyone who speaks anything against the government, the army, religion, or political personalities, they'll be imprisoned or fined up to 10 million rupees. So it's like you just put a tape on their mouth and you expect them to do journalism or to speak about it, and it's not going to happen because they have hired a team of IT experts, and they are going to control everything that goes online, on air, on any line, on telephone and everything.
Interesting that they use cyber methods to do it. Clearly, they see the internet as a major threat. You said in your opening statement, Ms. Kareem, blogging is the best way to resist authoritarianism or majoritarianism. Why is that?
Well, I think, you know, since, say, the Iraq War, when that was the context when blogging came to the picture and was really powerful and stayed for many years now, blogging is replaced by, say, Twitter, you know, and social media. And I think now people are leaving social media into channels that are more private, where you can be less visible, less, you know, vulnerable to persecution. Yes, I think blogging is a great alternative to classical media. However, it's also being threatened again. So good enough that people are creative in trying to resist this oppression.
Let's take a closer look. Some young bloggers in Tunisia have became the face of their country's resistance.
She gave young Tunisians a face and a voice. During the heady days of the Arab Spring, Lina Ben-Meni blogged about the revolution going on in her country, and the world read along. The government tried to censor her entries, but the young activist refused to give in to intimidation. In 2011, DW honored her at the Best of Blog Awards for her entry, A Tunisian Girl. The North African country has become a glimmer of hope for democracy in the Arabic-speaking world. Are bloggers the new front line in the fight for democracy and freedom of the press?
Andreas Kluth, would you say bloggers do have more freedom, more impact than traditional journalists?
No, certainly not that, but more. But what blogging and now microblogging, like tweeting and so forth, has done is a certain kind of revolution that I've compared to Gutenberg's printing press revolution in the 15th century, which launched the Reformation, the Renaissance, the modern era. This blogging and these micro tools, in effect, give each of us a printing press. And there's a multitude of voices that used to be inaudible that are now audible. That's what I meant when I said that every country, every society now gets the press it deserves. We're all part of this conversation. If we blog banal things, hateful things, we deserve the press we get. That is the climate, the atmosphere we create. If we try to inform ourselves, try to think, try to analyze, then that's the kind of press we get. So in a very direct way, it's included more, it's broadened audiences, made them part of the conversation. Generally, that's a good thing.
To what degree does that broadening, the multiplier effects, the visibility, to what degree does that serve to protect a journalist? We saw in the report that this young blogger had been given airtime by DW and in that way made more visible. But I know that you had won an award from the U.S. State Department. You were visible. You had been recognized, and yet in the end it didn't help.
What didn't help was me coming here and being away from the situation that I was in, kind of. The audience, or the readers, I should say, here are not interested in the problems of the people in Pakistan. A layman's problem, a woman who struggles every day to get out of her house and to educate her children, how the poverty affects people, how the rate of education is so low in our country. So these things, I feel that they don't get much more exposure as they need to. And these were the subjects that I was offering, and it seems there's no market for it. So
you have less material to work with now that you are in exile, essentially. Yes. But coming back to the fact that you had received public official recognition from the U.S. State Department while you were still in Pakistan, and yet it didn't protect you.
The problem is that I can't write in Pakistan anymore because once you apply for an asylum, it has a kind of a state effect, and the newspaper and the media houses back there, they are afraid to print my work because that might get them into trouble. And this is kind of a mentality that goes by. And so here I need, either I should find my niche here or just forget about it.
I know Ms. Jamal has said she actually regrets the fact that she can't go back, in some ways regrets the fact that she is now based here. Would you say the same about being based in New York? Can you do the work you want to do? Or how do you also feel cut off from your material?
Yeah, I think I do feel cut off. And I had to decide at some point that, you know, this is the context now of someone else, you know, and it's their struggle. And like the possible thing for me is to think that, you know, I have some privilege and I can be a backup for them, you know. So there is always, like, as I mentioned, when arrest happen, people from inside might be watching out from mentioning these details, but I can't do that, you know. I can't talk about the case of friends being tortured in prison, you know. So whenever I can, you know, I fill in, but certainly it becomes now the work of someone else to pick up and keep on with it.
You are both living in the West now. I'd like to take a brief look at the situation of the West, of the press in the West, because here, too, it is under attack from populist politicians, for example, who often accuse the press of lying.
In 2015, German prosecutors brought charges against Markus Beckedahl for betraying state secrets. The journalist had published leaked internal papers from the country's secret service. The charges were eventually dropped, but journalists now fear they could be put under surveillance. Many members of the right-wing Pegida movement view journalists as little more than liars and purveyors of propaganda. At demonstrations, reporters have been repeatedly insulted and even physically attacked. And plurality in the press is also under threat as economic pressure rises. More and more media outlets are now gathered in fewer and fewer hands. At the same time, newsrooms are being streamlined and downsized. Is freedom of the press in Germany in danger?
Andreas Kluth, what do you think? How would you answer that question? You said yourself, freedom of the press is the first sign of freedom generally. We have seen attacks on journalists here at the rallies of Pegida that was just shown there in the report. We also have just seen the Chancellor saying an investigation can go ahead against a comedian whom the president of Turkey accuses of insulting him. Is that press freedom?
First of all, there's absolutely no threat to press freedom in Germany. We've now gone from made a quantum leap to another. It's a matter of proportion. This is part of the eternal debate over whether the press is doing its job well, whether it has the trust of the population. But there's no actual. This is self-correcting. Now, what you see, though, is interesting, in fact, in Germany. I, as an outsider, working for a British magazine, coming here from America, do feel that the press corps and, for instance, the politicians are in a much more cozy relationship with each other than in America, where it is much more adversarial and where people like it that way, especially after some scandals that happened in the run-up to the Second Gulf War in the press. Okay, that has not happened in Germany, and I think some of these conspiracy theories that you see now in groups like Pegida, the Alternative for Germany. They are similar to conspiracy theories we've had for many years in America, for instance, in the demographic that was the Tea Party and so forth. And essentially it falls down to that the mainstream media, or what they call the lamestream media, is politically correct and self-censors in some way. It is actually true. There are studies that in Germany, for instance, the journalists they overrepresent certain center-left, the Green Party, certain opinions, and underrepresent others. They're not a mirror of the society. And I think there is a certain groupthink, okay? That is, again, this is self-correcting, that in the press landscape, others will come forward and fill the gaps. That's already happening. That's the market at work. However, I do think at the moment that there is a genuine case to be made. That's not the one they're making at Pegida, but I could make a genuine case that German journalism is too clubby, too cozy, too coy, and doesn't always serve the population well.
Which, of course, is what happened in the U.S. in the run-up to the Iraq War, where the Washington Post simply bought the whole government line. I'd like to hear from both of you. You are now based in Germany, Meera Jamal. Mona Kareem is now based in the U.S. What's your sense of the situation of the press in those countries? Just absolutely rosy, or are there areas where you would say it's questionable for you?
As compared to from where we come, it's totally rosy. I think the risk that we had back there are quite different from the risk that journalists have here. So it's
what risk do they have here, briefly?
in case if there's like being attacked by the mob, like in Pageda rally, but in Pakistan it's the government, it's the military intelligence, the other agencies that can just report you missing. After certain days, you'll be gone, no trace.
Ms. Kareem.
Well, I think when it comes to U.S. media, it's very much polarizing, and I don't think there is anything special about mainstream media in the U.S. But of course, alternatively, there are people trying to be creative with whatever they offer. For me, as a refugee there, I think media is not helping me, correct the discourse or even, bring anyone into the conversation. And with the rise of what we can say the right wing, it's becoming even more personal. So, yeah, a journalist does not get threatened personally, but is there a context for that anyways?
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us here today, and thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon.